Hello and welcome to episode 8 of Hammer Time. Today we're going to talk about who's going to defend us from the so-called defenders of democracy. But before I come to today's show, let me tell you, as you can see, we have upgraded the studio, we have upgraded the audio setting. I know that in the past there were some issues with the sound quality. I hope that this is now something that has been taken care of. So everybody who kept the faith with Hammer Time, I'm deeply grateful, and I hope that we continue to live up to the high standards of our audience. Also, I'm very happy to announce that today's guest will be Mr. Andy Ngo. Many of you are probably familiar with Andy. He wrote a New York Times bestseller in 2021 titled Unmasked: Inside the Secret Plan of Antifa to Undermine Democracy. So he's a prolific author. He's the senior editor at the Post Millennial. So it's a very interesting story to tell. He's a fantastic journalist, and we will talk a little about what's going on in the world of journalism. And are journalists still trying to report the news? Are most of them activists? What are the ethics in journalism today? So a lot of stuff I think that you find very interesting. And as always, the first 20 minutes of this conversation will be right after the show, and then you can enjoy the full hour over at Brussels Signal. So I really hope that you're going to check it out. Now, as I said, today's topic is going to be about who protects us from the protectors of democracy, who defends us from the defenders of democracy. And the reason why I picked this is, as most of you probably know, there have been regional elections in Germany, and two parties, and I kind of want to elaborate on this for a second as well, that made the most significant gains were the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, and the BSW, the Alliance Sarah Wagenknecht, or in German, the Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht. And there is a debate going on whether or not these parties are right-wing, left-wing, or something else. And I think that they are actually something else. I think their most defining feature is not that the AfD is more towards the right and the BSW is more towards the left. It is that they're anti-establishment parties. And I think this is an important distinction, because being left and being right is one thing. Like the powers that are not necessarily threatened by new parties on the right or new parties on the left. What they're mostly threatened by are parties that are anti-establishment. And this is something, of course, what we saw happening after these regional elections in Germany, is that now the Green Party, which, by the way, barely made it into one regional parliament, and in another one, they didn't even make it into the regional parliament, so they are not necessarily the most voted party by the people, definitely not as, for example, the AfD, who got over 30%, for example, in Thuringia. Now, they are calling for what they call a federal state task force to protect democracy. Now, we all know what this means, right? When they talk about protecting democracy, they mean saving the establishment from having to give up power. And in order to do so, the attempt will be to use tools of the state, to use the power of the state to prevent alternative political movements from coming to power. And the reason why this is important, it's not just about what these potential alternatives would like to do. It is the very nature of democracy that established powers can be voted out of office. So everything that happens these days under the so-called defending of democracy or protecting of democracy, at the end of the day, is the exact opposite. Because the whole point of democracy is that you can change who's in charge, but you don't have to change the system. And I think this is a very important distinction. In a functioning democracy, you can have right of center, left of center, conservative, liberal. You can have all kinds of different political movements being in charge without having to change the system itself. But of course, what is currently happening is, if you take away the possibility for the people to change who is in charge within the political system, at some point the people will say, well, maybe the system itself is flawed. Maybe the system itself needs changing. So in many ways, those who claim that they defend democracy are its worst enemies, because they try by all means necessary to prevent that change of power that is essential to the idea of democracy. But if you take this essential factor away, then, of course, what's the point of the democratic system in the first place? It becomes an oligarchy. It becomes an elite project where no change is possible anymore. And you kind of can see how the panic is spreading, that people might turn to non-established political movements. I give you an example. For example, when we look at what's currently going on with Elon Musk, this was an article in The Guardian where Robert Reich, who was the Labor Secretary under Bill Clinton, is now suggesting that Elon Musk should be threatened with arrest. Because if he allows voices on his platform that people to the left, like Mr. Reich, do not like, well, the best way to prevent this from happening is if we put those who say things we don't want to hear into prison. Let me read this to you, just to make clear, I'm not exaggerating. This is a direct screenshot from the article that Mr. Reich wrote in The Guardian. So this is not secondhand or anything. This is a direct quote. Regulators around the world should threaten Musk with arrest if he doesn't stop disseminating lies and hate on X. Now, lies and hate is a tricky thing. First of all, hate is a human emotion. Every one of us has something that they hate. Some of us maybe more, some of us maybe less, but it's an emotion, right? If something bothers you, if something makes you angry, like you cannot ban those things. And the other thing is, it's a question of interpretation, isn't it? So if I root for Manchester City and you root for Manchester United and I say Manchester United sucks, am I disseminating hate? Am I inciting hate? Depends. Who will decide? And this is, of course, where the rubber hits the road. Because the idea is that the state, and ideally the state staffed with people like Mr. Reich, they will define what hate is. So you might say something that you believe is entirely innocent, but the state might tell you, oh, no, this is actual hate, right? Or what about comedy? What about satire, right? They work with exaggeration. So all of a sudden, how do you know that somebody's not going to say, oh, this is a lie, right? And therefore they can ban you, they can prosecute you, which is, of course, precisely what we see currently happening in the United Kingdom. So none of the things I'm talking about today is hypothetical. We see this going on in parts of the world where we would have never expected or we would have been afraid to see it happening. The United Kingdom is one example, but take a look more currently at Brazil, right? Brazil has actually been banning Elon Musk's platform. They have been banning X. They try to seize property of Musk, of SpaceX in Brazil. So this is, again, a direct case where you have a government, or in this case, I would call him a rogue judge, is trying to influence the ability of people to find alternative sources of information. And this judge has openly said that, for example, the fact that Donald Trump was on X is a reason for the platform to be banned. So the attempt will be that you can only see, that you can only hear, that you can only read information that was filtered through or that ran through a filter of the gatekeepers of the ruling, the existing establishment. And I'll go into more detail what I mean by the establishment, because I understand sometimes we use these terms establishment, elite, without clarifying them, and then they can get an almost conspiratorial tinge, and I want to avoid this. What I mean by establishment, by elite, I mean the group of people in media, in culture, in academia, and politics that signed up to the famous saying of Angela Merkel in 2015 that their policies are without alternative, right? This idea that there is one way of doing things, there is one way of approaching problems, and anything else cannot be done, is impossible, should not be done, you name it. The sentiment, what I call anti-establishment, is the idea, the approach that no, there are actual alternatives, right? That you can do policy different in the realm of economics, in the realm of migration, in the realm of cultural policy. So this is what I mean, right? Who defends the status quo? I think that's probably another very good description of what we mean by the establishment, right? Who defends the status quo, the agreement on all these different issues? And who tries to take an alternative perspective? Who tries to take an alternative position? And I think this is when we talk about establishment and anti-establishment, that one is trying to prevent this, to continue to protect the status quo, and the other tries to change it. And I think this is a very, very important distinction. And we see now, as this is going on, this is one of my favorite headlines in a very good German-speaking outlet, the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, from a wonderful journalist, Beatrice Achterberg, where she talks about an article that says that in Germany now, after these regional elections, the media is now starting to say the following. A moderator said in a live broadcast on election night, the person with the most democratic votes at the moment is Mario Voigt. Mario Voigt was the candidate for the Conservatives. And of course, this means that the votes for the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, were undemocratic. So this is the new trick here. So even if a party like the AfD gets a majority of the votes, The argument will be, yes, but the voters, the votes that they got were from the undemocratic part, right? These were the undemocratic votes. So you can end up in a situation where maybe the AfD has 40%, 45%, who knows, maybe even 50%. But you could still claim that, well, the other party, for example, the Greens, that only have 5%, they are still more legitimate because the 5% of the Greens, those are the actual democratic votes, where the 50% of the AfD, those are the undemocratic votes. And this is, of course, something that we mean. We say, well, this is no longer than a democratic system, right? This is just a system that tries to protect itself. And this, as always, I believe is the true fear that we see currently happening, which is why they want to crack down on Musk's X, why they kind of want to put pressure on alternative media platforms like Rumble, why the founder of Telegram was arrested in France. Like, these are attempts by governments, by the established media to regain their gatekeeping function. And what this also reflects, right, it is a fear of the people. And this brings us back to the famous saying by Jefferson that, of course, I'm paraphrasing here, that in a free society, government fears the people, and in a tyranny and unfree society, people fear the government. And we are living more and more in a world where governments try to achieve the latter. Because when hypothetically, when they would arrest Elon Musk, it's not just about Elon Musk. You send a signal, right? You say, if we can diminish the reach, if we can threaten successfully, if we can blackmail the world's most well-known probably and richest or second richest person on the planet, imagine what we can do to you. So it's an intimidation strategy. It's you know, if you think about a good cop, bad cop routine, that's the bad cop routine is, you know, we throw you in prison, we take away the funds of your company. And the good cop routine is to say, well, you know, do you really have to have an opinion on certain issues? Do you really have to talk about the things? Do you have to post on Facebook about migration? Do you have to post on X about climate change? Why not just talk about something else? So this is another thing, of course, that they're trying to do, right? That they take the issues that are important for you, that they try to extract them from the public discourse. Think about the assassination attempt on Donald Trump. This is a prime example of this. Nobody talks about it anymore. It's as if it has never happened. Like, this has been memory hold after 2 to 3 weeks. It's like it never happened. We still talk about January 6th. Right, so we still talk about things that have been significantly longer ago, and I would argue are potentially less significant than what almost happened to the former president. But the decision was made, again, by the establishment, as I said before, by the protectors of the status quo, that we should no longer talk about this, like that this should be excluded from polite discourse. And this is, of course, also the reason, justifiably so, why parties like the Alternative for Germany or Reform in the UK or Le Pen are increasingly winning elections, because despite what many will tell you, the people are not stupid. On the contrary, the people know very well what's going on. They are just not yet entirely sure how to react to it. And this is one of these cases, and I think that kind of one of the first reactions they have is, as Mark Steyn, the famous Canadian author, once said, if you have a political culture where all the important topics are not being dealt with by the quote-unquote respectable parties, then people will turn to the less respectable parties who are actually willing to treat with these issues. And again, if we take Germany as an example, if we take Donald Trump in 2016 as an example, if every respectable movement refuses to talk about migration, then people will turn to maybe less respectable people or less respectable movements, but at least they talk about what's important for them. And this is, by the way, as a quick note, this is also the highest form of decadence. There's always a discussion, and I mentioned this before, what do we mean by decadence? Like, what does the word, is it luxury? Is it, you know, if you live in a materialistically beautiful world or so? But that's not all of it. I think you can live in luxury, but still understand which areas of life, which issues are the important ones and which issues are not important. And the kind of world we live in at the moment is that so often it seems as if politicians are focusing on things that are entirely irrelevant for a significant part of the population, but the things that are relevant for a significant part of the population, these issues are being ignored. And that's the true form of decadence, that you think you can just postpone the things that matter for most and focus on niche issues. And this, I believe, is something that bothers people very much as well. Now, you might say, it's the United Kingdom, or you say it's Brazil, Latin America, they do things differently there. Germany, we all know that the Germans, that there is always a sense that they might retract or retreat into a more authoritarian political system, so nobody should be surprised about what the Greens are doing. But I would say it might also happen in the United States. And to show some proof of that, I would like to play the following clip featuring Kamala Harris.
He has lost his privileges, and it should be taken down. And the bottom line is that you can't say that you have one rule for Facebook and you have a different rule for Twitter. The same rule has to apply, which is that there has to be a responsibility that is placed on these social media sites to understand their power. They are directly speaking to millions and millions of people without any level of oversight or regulation. And that has to stop.
We cannot have that, right? They're speaking to millions of people without any oversight or regulation. So as I said before, the dream scenario for those in charge is that whatever is being posted on social media first runs to a filter of their opinion, of their inclinations, of their biases. It reminds me of something during COVID that Jacinda Ardern said, the then Prime Minister of New Zealand, and I'm slightly paraphrasing, said, every information that you get, if it doesn't come, it's only true if it comes from us. And this is, of course, the exact scenario that some on the right as well, but I think this is more common on the left. This is the scenario that they would like. That whatever information comes, it either comes directly from them or they approved it first. And we know now, just a week ago, Mark Zuckerberg made exactly this case. Whatever you think of Mark Zuckerberg and Meta and Facebook, he said that yes, the Biden administration was leaning on Meta, on Facebook, in order to prevent certain information from going out or to flag certain news pieces or headlines as misinformation or disinformation, or to report on certain issues in a specific way. So this is going on. So this is not just, as I said before, hypothetical. This is something that is taking place while we speak. And the question then is, right, because I think this is another very crucial point. Why are they doing that? Right? So what are they so afraid of? What is it that terrifies them so much? And there are lots of theories out there. And there I have to say we have to be very careful, because there is something going on, right? There is something going on that might be akin to a conspiracy, but we have to be careful not to go too far down the rabbit hole, because it's a combination, and I will talk more about this next week as well, of ideologues who really have a vision, I think in my view and probably yours as well, a vision that we do not want to see fulfilled, but they have a vision. They have an idea what the future is supposed to look like. Then we have those who just jump on the bandwagon. I think this is very often what companies are doing, right? When you think about all this wokeness very often that takes place within the business world, I don't think that many of them genuinely believe it. I think they just do it because they believe it's A, good for the bottom line, or B, it saves them a lot of hassle, which is why we see if pushback is happening, whether it was at Harley-Davidson, Costco, or also, of course, Budweiser, right? Then they adapt fairly quickly. And another one, of course, is you have the occasional grifter as well, right? They do it not because they believe it, they do it because they think it is something that makes them money. And it's particularly in the latter camp where I would think that somebody like Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum is. So, and believe me, I'm no fan of that institution, but I think very often there seems to be the sense that if only Klaus Schwab and the WF would be gone, if the United States would decide that they carpet bombed Davos, I'm being facetious here, being hyperbolic here, then all the problems, all the issues that we have would disappear. But I think once again, we are mixing up causes and symptoms here. Klaus Schwab, I think, was just smart enough, one has to give him that, to understand where the cultural trends in the West are going. Now, he has certainly reinforced those trends, but I think in many ways, he just jumped on a bandwagon on a train that has already left the station, and he just made a lot of money out of doing so. So what we have to look at what are the roots of what is going on and why we should be concerned about this. And one thing I believe that, and we talked about this previously in the episode on oikophilia and oikophobia, one very important part is that within Western culture, this idea that the West has to atone, that the West is the font of all evil, that the West is, when in doubt, the cause of all the bad things that are happening, and therefore we have to find ways to atone. I think that is still at the root of many of the issues that we are facing. And I want to give you a quick example. So this was a headline from Brussels Signal, and a media that I'm always strongly recommending. about what's currently going on. So the European Commission has handed nearly 9 million euros to an online project that helps migrants evade deportation in Germany. Brussels Signal has discovered this. By the way, it's great reporting from my friend Carl. I highly recommend that you check out their page and read this article. But just kind of to tell you what's going on here. So you have a situation where both officially the European Union, but also in particular Germany says, okay, we need to deport criminals. We need to close the borders. We need to be much tougher on migration. And then it turns out that the European Union, the European Commission itself, is using money to fund NGOs, or in this case, to fund online projects, whose main purpose, whose sole purpose, is to ensure that migrants of whatever color, of whatever purpose, of whatever reason that they came in the first place, that they can evade deportation. So to make sure that people who got a court order that they have to leave the country, the European Union that officially says, yes, we understand. We also think we need to get tough on migration. We have to find other ways to tackle the demographic problem. We have to close our borders and so on and so on and so on. They, in effect, are funding the very people who pursue the opposite goal. So when they say they want to change anything in the migration policy, they are lying. Because the left hand says we want to change something, but the right hand is actually giving money to organizations, to NGOs, to projects, which pursue the exact opposite goal. And it's not surprising, right, that these things have consequences, that this belief, on the one hand, that your country is the worst, that your culture and civilization is the worst, and that the only way you can solve that problem is by integrating, by importing more and more people, because this, I believe, is ultimately the goal here. Right? Europe's, and partially also the United States, Europe's migration policy is not driven by humanitarian concerns. It's not driven by the idea, oh, these are people we have to help. It is driven by the idea that every single person from a non-Western culture that comes to the West is one step towards atonement. But of course, as you can imagine, the final goal, the final destination of full atonement will never be reached. So this is the danger. So people say, some say, right, that oh, that's the most horrible line you can always use. People say, so let me be more concrete here. Within the mainstream media, you always read that, oh, the great replacement theory. That's a conspiracy theory. And there are some conspiratorial elements in this that I just want to mention real quick. For example, the idea, and I hope that, I found some disagreements on this in my comments, but it's important for me to make this absolutely clear. This is not a Jewish conspiracy, right? This idea, for example, in Germany, this idea in France, that the Jewish population there, that they are hell-bound on importing more and more and more people from Muslim countries, which all hate them. Right? That would be a suicidal policy. So this is not a great Jewish conspiracy. What is true, of course, right, is when you say, okay, fine, if you look at some, let's say, more official institutions and say, well, but they are supportive of mass migration. Now, that is correct, but almost every large-scale official institution in the West has been supportive of mass migration, because bringing me back to what I said earlier in today's show, because that has been the establishment position. Mass migration for 40 years has been the establishment position. And yes, of course, some members of the establishment, some institutions that are part of the establishment also happen to be, happen to be Jewish institutions or to be of Jewish character. But that does not make it a Jewish conspiracy. So this is the thing. So one thing can be true, that mass migration, of course, by its very nature, and we have the numbers for this, leads to a kind of form of replacement. But that does not mean that this is like a conspiracy by one very specific group. I think this is a dangerous way of thinking about this, because it also prevents you from winning people to your side that share your views, that share your fears, that share your take on this. So I think that's a very, very important element. But another consequence of this, of course, is, and this is, I would say, is also another goal of this, is that you, through mass migration, also want to then defeat the one idea, the one ideology that I think the left hates more than anything else, and that's nationalism, that's patriotism, that's national pride. And I can show you some numbers for this as well, because this is something that we have directly, very recently done from the United Kingdom, which is British nationalist sentiment between 1995 and 2003. And what this shows very good, right, is that Britain's national pride has hit an all-time low, according to a new survey. And we also have the actual numbers of the survey. One is the British nationalist sentiment between 1995 and 2023. And if you look at these bars, so one of the reasons why, if you're listening to this, I hope you also check out the YouTube channel so that you can see these graphs and what they show, is that between 1995 and 2013, with few exceptions, there is a downward trend. So British identity, British nationalism is declining. So for example, generally speaking, Britain is a better country than most other countries. In 1995, over 50% held that position, also in 2013. In 2023, it's now down to about 40%. And you see this in all other areas as well. We have a similar, another graph that shows the same thing. It's about pride in Britain's achievements. There you see the same trend, right? You have highs in the early 90s, even in the mid 2000s, but then in the 2020s it starts to go down. So people in Britain and the United Kingdom, but I think the same can be observed elsewhere as well, that pride in one's country, pride in one's nation's history is something that is declining. And there are of course two reasons for this. One of it is it's what is taught to us in school, right? One is we are taught that patriotism, nationalism is a very bad thing. But another one is, of course, that if you have large numbers of people coming to your country with different backgrounds, with different cultures, at some point they will stick, which I personally understand, they will stick with their pride, their identity that they had, their loyalty to their country of origin and not to their new country. And you might say now, what's the big deal? Who cares if people identify with the country they live in? Who cares if people are proud of the country they live in? But I think this is a very dangerous attitude because it cares quite a bit. Think about it from this perspective. We all pay a significant number of taxes, right? We all see or view or hope to view the state and its institutions as legitimate. But in order to view them as legitimate, in order to be willing to pay taxes, right, you have to have a sense that this political system represents you, right? That this political system is something that you feel you are part of. If that is no longer the case, well, then your willingness of contributing, but also your willingness of viewing that system as legitimate will decline significantly. It is not something that you see as being part of your history, that you see as part of the up and down, the ebbs and flows that has been a constant through generations. That disappears. So these things matter quite a bit. Look at it from this perspective. The world consists of nation states, but if that is kind of the main unit, well, in order for that to function, there needs to be a sense of a nation. If that disappears, then you cannot have a nation state in which nobody takes the concept of the nation seriously. Whatever then it is that follows that, but it's going to be something else. And this brings me, of course, to another key problem, a speech by the Norwegian king, yes, there are still kings around, that he held in 2016, that popped up again a couple of days ago, and it was kind of quite a celebrated. So let me read this to you real quick. King of Norway delivers emotionally charged speech in favor of LGBTQ rights, refugees, and tolerance. And then he said the following. Norwegians are girls who love girls, boys who love boys, and boys and girls who love each other. Norwegians believe in God, Allah, everything and nothing. The king was Harald V. Now, this embodies the problem that we are facing. Particularly the last point. It says, Norwegians, they believe in everything, they believe in nothing, they believe in God, they believe in Allah. Who cares? It doesn't matter. But of course it matters. So this idea that he's presenting, that Norway basically means that it's whatever's your bag, nobody really cares. It makes no difference. It's a very dangerous ideology because of course it makes a difference. And very often the people, if you allow me saying that, the people who believe in Allah do have a significant problem with the people who believe in nothing or who believe in LGBTQ rights, who believe in tolerance. And you cannot beat something with nothing. And this is basically what the King of Norway is proposing. He says, yeah, there are all these people with different beliefs, but you know what? For me, they're all the same. Good for him if they are. If everything is the same for him, fantastic. But this is not the attitude that most people in this world have. There are, and I count myself among them, and I'm sure that many of you are as well, there is a significant number of people who still believe in things and believe that there are things that have more value than others. I mean, the beauty of a planet with different nations, different cultures, different civilizations is precisely this, that different ideas, different values can, people that hold these different ideas and different values, they can get together in different places and then make their own societies. But you cannot create a society, you cannot create a nation built on the idea that it's all the same. You believe in something, you believe in nothing. Because the believe in nothing part, as King Harold said, that's at best a temporary phase. Because the people who believe in something at some point simply will not allow you to believe in nothing. So this idea of kind of the uber-liberal, kind of the neutral state as it exists is just something that doesn't work. And I can prove it to you. Because once you realize that in fact there is a cultural struggle, a value struggle, the government, the state that pretends to say it's all the same for us, in fact is beginning to take sides. And let me show you one quick headline out of the UK, what's happening there in some schools. In some schools in the UK now, teachers will be trained to challenge whiteness in schools. Now, whatever that whiteness means, but going back to King Harold, right? So apparently it's not as easy as he was saying that some people believe in something, some people believe in nothing, because apparently the state now believes that they have to tell, and a majority of the people in Britain is still white, that they have to tell them that based on the color of your skin, which by the way is probably the most racist thing you can imagine, that they say we kind of have to teach you, in a sense, to feel uncomfortable, both metaphorically and symbolically, that you have to feel, and literally, pardon me, that you have to feel uncomfortable in your own skin. And what makes this so frustrating, and I said this before, is that these ideologies, kind of particularly whether it's multiculturalism, whether it's wokeness, whether it's the idea of white privilege, these are ideologies that free you from knowing anything about the world. Because if you take a look at how the world actually works, what you will find out is that the West is, in fact, the most tolerant place in the world. There's a great map that was put together with the World Values Survey, the European Values Survey, and if you look at this. So what this graph shows you, let me make sure that I get it right. It shows that the blue areas, the dark blue areas, are 0% to 4.9% about the following. It's the share that answered people of another race when asked to select from groups of people they would not want to have as a neighbor. So in the United States, in Europe, only between 0 to 5% of the people say they would not want to have a neighbor from another race. In other parts, the dark red, as we can see here, for example, in Turkey would be one example, that's 40%. So 40% of the people who were asked said they would not want to have a neighbor from a different race. So the most tolerant places in the world are the worlds that we would generally count as being part of the West. But it's not just that. Let's also look at what is about the non-Western parts of to go back to the previous graph, about the non-white parts of the population. What's their take on diversity? This is another graph that I find quite enlightening. If you take a look at this, this graph shows you how racial groups rate each other. So meaning that, do you like them better? Do you like them more? Or do you like them less? And so this is going to take a minute, but I think it's very good to take a look at this. So when they asked white people, right, how do white people rate other white people? It's about 70% positive. How do white people rate black people? It's about 70% positive. How do white people rate Hispanics? It's about 70% positive. How do white people rate Asians? It's about 70% positive. As you can see in this graph, there's almost no moving. So basically, based on this graph, white people judge all the other groups the same way they judge themselves. Now, if you look at other groups, if you look at Hispanics, so Hispanics have about 70%, 75% approval of blacks. They have an almost 80% approval rate of other Hispanics. They have about 70%, 75% of other Asians, and they only have about about 65% of white. So there's a much more diverse view. So they like white people the least. They like, of course, their own racial identity the most, and the rest is in the middle. Similar trend, just more extreme with black respondents. Very similar also with Asian respondents. So every group, the group that is mostly accused or most often accused of racism is, at least according to this graph, according to this poll, is in fact the least racist group, right? They make the least distinction between the different backgrounds, the different ethnic or racial background of people. And yet we are constantly told, right, that white Europeans, white Americans are the most racist people that exist. Now, let's take another look at who actually likes diversity. I think that's another important question, because it's also something we are told that diversity is so important, that diversity is such a crucial element. Now, again, this is these fantastic graphs. So what this says is, let me read to you the question that has been asked, is, on balance, do you think having an increasing number of people of many different races, ethnic groups, and nationalities in the United States makes this country a better place to live, a worse place to live, or does it make no difference? And if you look at it, the kind of the most significant group of people that says it's the most approval, you find among white liberals. They say 87.17% say that it makes it better. In the other groups, that's significantly lower. Like non-liberals say about 42% say it makes it better. Hispanics say 45% make it better, and blacks say 54% make it better. 34% of blacks say that it makes no difference. 37% of Hispanics say it makes no difference. And 30% of non-liberal whites say it makes no difference. And then there are smaller numbers between 11 and 26% that say that it makes it worse. But this is a very intriguing phenomenon. So diversity, for the most part, is an obsession of the economically very often well-off white liberal class. Like, this is not a widespread agreement. So there's this idea that the diversity obsession is a phenomenon that would be, one would think, be particularly important for minority groups, for ethnic minorities. But in fact, it's probably one of the most white attitudes that are out there. So when we talk about white privilege, well, being obsessive about diversity would probably fall into this category. Now, as I said before, and I said it in previous episodes, I believe that this obsession, for example, with diversity is not really driven by the desire for diversity itself. It is much more driven by a sense of, if we get more diverse, we can kind of dilute our own history, right? Again, as I said before, it's a form of atonement for our historical past. It's an atonement for the sins of the West. And the reason why this is important is because that attitude is also bleeding over into other areas, into other disciplines. We talked about this on the show, and I've written quite extensively about it. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with the so-called degrowth movement. Right? The degrowth movement is a movement that claims that in order to save the planet, in order to save humanity, we have to scale back living standards. We have to scale back our use of energy. We have to abandon the idea of economic growth. We have to abandon the idea that everybody in the world can have a higher standard of living with every passing year. Now, they did a fascinating study about studies in degrowth. And what they found was that actually most of these quote-unquote studies are mostly opinion. They don't have a lot of quantitative data. They don't have a lot of qualitative data. They are, to a large extent, scientifically worthless. Yet you might ask yourself, why are they still being published? Why do they still play an important role? Because they do not satisfy scientific curiosity, they satisfy a psychological need. Because these days, and this is a topic I will talk more about in the weeks to come, these days, to a certain extent, the authority that was once held by religion is now replaced by the authority of science. And we can have a conversation whether this is a good or a bad thing. But what's absolutely clear is that even the most wacky ideology will try to claim that they're actually scientific. So you have something like the degrowth movement, which is an ideological movement. You can call it a neo-communist, a neo-Marxist movement. I'm fine with any label you want to use. But their goal is a reduction of the living standards, a reduction of the energy that we can use, a reduction of the comforts of prosperity. But of course, just preaching that in a religious manner of saying we want, kind of punishing yourself and saying, we want to atone for our sins, we want to atone for the horrific past of our culture and civilization, therefore we should forego any kind of material pleasure or whatnot, that would not have many takers. That is not a convincing argument. But if you cloak it in science, if you say, oh, we did a study that shows that degrowth is the right way, even though, as based on this study, I know I'm now arguing with the study against the study, but if it shows that actually the methods that were used were not scientific at all, but they were still enough to be published in a quote-unquote pseudo-scientific journal, right, then it becomes authority. Then all of a sudden it is something that can be entered into the political discourse. And just a quick remark, this is exactly what happened. Ursula von der Leyen, I mentioned this on the show before, right? She headed a degrowth or beyond growth conference in the European Parliament. So again, this has been a fringe position, or I would say it is still a fringe position in the larger part of the population because nobody really wants to have diminished living standards. But within the political sphere, coming back to my term from early on, within the establishment, of course, this is a real political prospect. This is a real political program. We see it in other areas as well, what I call fake engagement. When you look at the pro-Palestine protests at American universities, I mean, this is a fantastic graph that I want to show to you. Now, what this graph shows, like all the dots are private universities. And as you can see, the more expensive a private university is, the more intensive, the more radical the protests were. And this, again, it's as I said before, because being for degrowth, protesting Israel, being against the Jews, is a luxury phenomenon. This is something that does not happen that much in the working class or in the lower parts of society. And I have to say, I'm also speaking to you as my viewers and listeners. Be also very careful what kind of ideology you approve of, because do you really want to find yourself in the company of these very dangerous and very often, I would say, entirely ridiculous ideologies? Right? These are, as the sociologist Rob Henderson would say, these are luxury beliefs. Right? If you go to a university that pays, let me just check this real quick so that I don't say anything wrong, that has tuition fees above $60,000 per year, right? You're so well off, you live in such a shielded environment, most likely, that in order to find your identity, you'll probably sign up to all kind of crazy ideas. And the same thing is, it's particularly within this group of people, who are, by the way, the ones who have most profited from Western civilization, who believe that they now have to enforce or force their idea of atonement on others. And the last thing, right, kind of the last example, this also matters in the realm of the economy. So I kind of want to say that these fringe ideas do have an effect. So if we look at what's currently happening in Germany, for example, and Germany ran the experiment with having the socialists, the Greens, and the so-called liberals in government, what's happening there is that the country is economically declining. As you can see here, this headline, Germany in crisis, Intel and Volkswagen mule a multi-billion-dollar withdrawal from the country. And this is what's happening. Right? As countries lose confidence in themselves, as countries obsess about the idea that the future is only of secondary importance, but atoning for the past is the primary purpose, then you create conditions under which prosperity and flourishing is no longer possible. And this is something that we see, for example, now in Germany. And my fear is that both in the United Kingdom, but also in the United States and other parts of the world, there seems to be the desire to follow Germany down that primrose path towards economic decline, cultural decline, and social decline. And the significant role of this is, of course, also played by the media. And this is what I will talk about with Andy Ngo now. So thank you very much for everybody who tuned into the show. Enjoy the conversation I'm going to have with Andy. So please stay on. I think you're going to like it quite a bit. We covered a lot of ground, and it's really interesting. And if you like the 20 minutes you're going to see, please jump over to Brussels Signal. It will be there in the full version. I'll also post a link early next week. And of course, I will see you next week. Again, a little bit of a preview. Next week's guest will be Norman Fenton, who published a great book recently about the corona and COVID policies in the United Kingdom. So we're going to talk a little bit about what went wrong, what was going on with the vaccinations, what was going on with the data that was collected. So I know, because just as with Donald Trump's assassination attempt, there seems to be the attempt to memory hold what was happening during the Corona years, during the COVID years, and we will not allow this to happen on this show, so we're going to dive into this as well. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to seeing all of you next week. Hello and welcome to the 8th episode of the Brussels Signal podcast, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Andy Ngo. Andy Ngo is a writer, a journalist, a content creator. He's senior editor at the Post Millennial, and I'm happy to say also a very good friend of mine. He has written a book titled Unmasked, Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy, that came out in 2021. And I think it is fair to say, Andy, that you were one of the first journalists who really looked particularly on the West Coast into what Antifa is doing, kind of their methods, and you yourself literally fell victim to their brutal methods. I think you spent some time at the hospital, you were viciously attacked, so you did not just report about them, you were directly involved in a very negative way with them as well. If you look back at kind of your own experiences and how things have developed, you then moved from the United States, you live now in the United Kingdom, so you kind of are between, let's say, two places. You see both sides of Western civilization, on Anglo-Saxon civilization. Now, if you reflect back on what happened since 2021, do you feel that there is a sea change? We see now that conservative movements in continental Europe, Nigel Farage in the United Kingdom, that they gain traction. Do you think that Antifa and the woke worldview is declining, that they are less attractive, that people are no longer kind of as forcefully pushing for the agenda in the past? Or is this just a calm before a new storm?
So the beat of my journalism is broadly on far-left extremism, primarily in the United States, but as I've relocated to the United Kingdom and travel often to continental Europe, I've researched a bit into how Antifa and far-left movements manifest in Europe as well. And broadly, the radical left mobilize generally in opposition to something. That's how they're able to get their so-called comrades and supporters excited about a particular cause. It's usually not in support of anything, it's in opposition to something else. And so in America, there were, going back to 2016, we can go back further, but let's just focus on the last decade. There were two big moments that act as huge recruitment opportunities for the violent far left. There was the campaign of the first presidential campaign of Donald Trump in 2015, and then his election in 2016. And then in 2020, the death of George Floyd in Minnesota, which also then became a worldwide movement. In recent years in Europe, when there have been campaign seasons and elections in France or in Germany where the hard-right parties were expected to do well or did end up performing well, such as in France with the National Rally, and recently in Germany and in two eastern states with the Alternative for Deutschland, there have been Antifa mobilization against those parties as well. And we see this axis that allies that developed in opposition to the right. You have, on the ground, violent extremists who are militants, and they might call themselves anti-fascists, or they might call themselves something else. The name doesn't really matter. But they have legitimacy through their allies in the liberal establishment. So academe, journalists, politicians, governments as well, who legitimize the extremism of the far left. So in the United States, after George Floyd died, and this happened during a Trump presidency, it became very convenient that in opposition to Trump, the death of George Floyd could be exploited by Democrats in opposition to Donald Trump. And in jurisdictions where Democrats had power, those who otherwise would have been able to send in the National Guard or to empower local police to stop some of the political violence that was happening in the form of nightly riots, those Democrat politicians turned a blind eye and or actually even supported, at least in rhetoric, sometimes in other ways, the violent extremists who were killing people, causing havoc, chaos, setting fires, doing millions and millions and millions of damage in property to the American economy. All of that was allowed because the Democrats were sympathetic to the particular cause. I see something similar happening in the European continent as well. But the political context is different, and the government systems are different, and the laws are different. So in places like in the United Kingdom, where I'm at now, there is no equivalent of the First Amendment. So you can have a crackdown on essentially dissent. I'm speaking to you a number of weeks after protests that turned violent in particularly northern towns in England and in various working class areas where predominantly white English people protested. Some of them rioted and became violent against years and years of a number of grievances that have manifested. It's not just about mass migration. It's not just about radical Islam. It's not just about terrorist attacks. It's also about grooming gangs. It's about economic deprivations. It's about how they have not been able to enjoy the fruits of the increased GDP that happens every year in the UK, in part because of mass migration. And so under the Labour government, the full force of the law enforcement has been used to, I would argue, violently shut down the protests. I've been on the ground. You see one of the accusations that came out is two-tier policing, in that when Muslims riot, and some of them did just a few weeks before the white people rioted, you didn't see Keir Starmer call these people thugs when migrants and or Muslim communities rioted. You didn't see police departments bring out their dog support team to sick the dogs onto people to stop them in the streets, whereas every tool was used against the people who were deemed far-right thugs. And so lots of issues here I'm bringing up to, I guess, to summarize a little bit. Across the West, there's in different spheres of influence in media, in government, in academia, in the activists. It's as if that they are very unified in their opposition to the right, whatever the right may be, and they use their power very effectively to counter the right, sometimes through support and or the use of political violence. None of them seem to really see a problem with when people on the left go too far. And so that creates this whole issue of where you have two-tier policing, two-tier responses from governments, and it's people to go online and they try to voice these views. Fortunately, in the U.S., we can do that. What I see happening in Germany and other European countries is that we're seeing, I think, an emergence of a liberal tyranny, in that under what is espoused to be liberal values, the state cracking down on freedom of expression. I'm reading some of these headlines about things happening in Germany, such as German authorities trying to use the law to force the social media platform Gab to name a person who had allegedly insulted or harassed a Green Party politician, allegedly called this woman fat. And so, it's like people who are deemed on the right, seems like they don't really have a lot of avenues to actually protest. When they're protested, they're met with state violence. When they speak out online, they're also met with suppression from the state. And so, sorry, that's a very long answer to what you had was a question.
It's a great answer, because I think you go really to the heart of what is a key issue, which is you use the term liberal tyranny, and I think that's a very good term, because it also undermines the foundation on which a democracy is built. And we hear so much these days about threats to democracy, and this is going to be the last election, and if so-and-so from the right wins, it will be the end of democracy. But of course, a cornerstone is that people at least feel that they are equal before the law. And exactly what you said. So if you look at what happened in the United States with the George Floyd riots, and it's interesting, the now vice presidential candidate for the current vice president, Kamala Harris, and potentially the next president, Tim Walz, he was the governor of Minnesota when these riots broke out. Right? He was governing over Minnesota when in Minneapolis, I think it was there where CNN had this funny Chiron about the fiery but mostly peaceful protests. So I think you can also see that this double standard also exists within the media, where the question was always, well, if these people riot, we must look at the root causes. Why are they so angry? And in a sense, it's justified. And I think, you see, of course, the same would happen with the riots in the UK. You're absolutely right. There were riots, there were things going on that are unexcusable, but the number of people who said, wait a moment, maybe the way they express themselves is wrong, but the grievances in and of themselves might actually have a justifiable basis, as you mentioned, right? So there seems to be this double standard. You also mentioned Germany. I think that we see similar things going on, where you have this absurd situation now where politicians are suing citizens for, yes, sometimes the jokes are not funny, and sure, one could say it's in bad taste to call someone fat. I mean, we all understand this. But it's kind of very odd, isn't it, that politicians or those who are in very high positions of power are so thin-skinned that they believe they have to use the full force of the law. We had a similar case, I know you mentioned this also on your X account, where I recommend every listener to sign up and to read what you publish there as well, where a German magazine, yes, it was a far-right magazine with, again, I wouldn't agree with many of the things they've written, but they bended a law that was designed to ban illegal organizations, organized crime, terrorist organizations, and they just redefined a magazine as an organization so they could ban it, right? I mean, there were courts who now overturned this decision by the Interior Ministry, but it did happen. So there is this double standard of law. So do you think it is fair to say that I'm exaggerating in order to make my question more provocative, but that very often those who claim to defend democracy, or that we have to be on the lookout how so-and-so is an enemy of democracy, that it's actually that in the name of defending democracy, many things happen that are a true attack on democracy, that the defenders are the biggest threat in truth?
Yes, what I found and find very sinister and disturbing about the American elections is that in 2020 and also in the current presidential campaign cycle now, is that the motto and slogan of Democrats is that vote for us to protect and to save democracy. And you see some variation of that type of argument as well among the liberal establishment in European countries. And I think what they're really trying to say is that they're arguing for, in terms of what they actually do when they're in power, they govern as liberal technocratic tyrants. And they should stop pretending that this has anything to do about democracy. I mean, liberals have been, in recent years, at the forefront of trying to erode democratic norms, particularly around speech. There's been a newly resurfaced video of the last time Kamala Harris campaigned for president in 2019 and 2020. She talked about, she was lamenting that there wasn't an ability for the US government at that time to regulate platforms like Twitter. And she was lamenting particularly because at that point, Donald Trump was still on Twitter. And then in 2020, she had actually wrote a letter and pressured Jack Dorsey. She was one among many, many liberals who did that, to pressure Jack Dorsey to ban Trump in Twitter and other social media platforms did. So these so-called liberals should stop pretending that they're trying to preserve civil rights or anything like that. In fact, what they're not willing to say, and I think the real issue is that they don't trust their citizenry they don't respect the decisions that their citizens may make. And so, but they couch their anti-liberal views as if it's about saving democracy. And this is, this goes to another issue that I write about often, is that the left is very good at using euphemisms or redefining well-understood words to have completely different meanings. The woke do this a lot, particularly with things around gender and violence and how they use that word. And so I'll go in another 10-minute tangent if I keep talking. So I'll stop right there.
Well, then just let me push a little further. If we would try to kind of compartmentalize the different actors that are involved in this, I tried it myself at home because I saw a video and it does indeed work. Right? You can ask Amazon's Alexa, of which I'm usually actually quite a fan of. You can ask, why should I vote for Donald Trump? And the answer you get is, I cannot give you political advice. That's not what she's doing. But then if you ask, why should I vote for Kamala Harris? Then it actually gives you a fairly elaborate answer. We saw also with AI, right? When you wrote certain questions on ChatGPT, you got quite left-leaning, left-biased answers. And of course, I would generally say, if you have to ask the device that turns on your lights, whom you should vote for, you probably should not vote in the first place. But nonetheless, it's interesting. It's not even subtle anymore. That's something that I guess the right has always been suspicious of, and that doesn't mean that the right has always been correct on everything they were saying or in all their beliefs. But one thing they were suspicious of, that there is in the institutions that that have a huge influence on daily aspects of our life. TV shows, movies, now apparently also artificial intelligence powered devices, that they have a left-leaning tendency, and that turns out to be correct. So do you think that it's not just about winning elections, it's not just about changing governments? There's also a huge front on the cultural side by, what would be the right-wing version of Amazon, the right-wing version of the Washington Post? And do you think that the right in its broadest sense, or the non-woke parts of society, do you think they do enough to also try to regain a foothold in these areas of life?
So I'm often very critical of other journalists, particularly when they're part of legacy liberal media, with the exception of a few institutions in the United States. Most in the United States and in most countries on the world, legacy media has a liberal bias, and that has a cascading effect on how, obviously, what information people see when they Google, what they read from the newspapers that they're familiar with. And I've unfortunately, like many conservative figures, have been on the receiving end of how the biased information that is published in.
But if I just talk, but would you define yourself as a conservative? I think for everyone who reads your book, of course, knows where you stand in relation to the woke movement, to attacks on freedom of speech, to the which I think is a wonderful term, the tyrannical liberalism that we are facing. But would you yourself define yourself as a conservative?
So I used to dodge this answering this question when I was asked. And
you don't have to answer it if you don't want to.
No. I'm answering. My point is that there was once upon a time where I thought it would be better for me as a journalist to not have my personal political identity out there. But over the years, the places that I write my pieces for, in addition to news pieces, I also do commentary and opinion. and I think it would be insulting to the intelligence of my readers and the public for me to try to dodge this. And so I am open about it now. And obviously it's no surprise to anyone. You go, you can see the issues that I care about are generally what conservatives care about. The reporting issues that I do comes from a worldview of that I would say is center-right and or conservative. There's a reason why I care a lot about exposing revolutionary, radical extremist movements, because I believe preserving tradition can be very important, actually, and is often overlooked by a lot of young people. On the contrary, we see a lot of establishment journalists pretend as if they are not biased in their reporting when they are explicitly often so biased with the left-wing bias in their reporting that they keep making mistake after mistake, and they don't own up to it, or that they seem to still try to present themselves as neutral arbiters of various facts, and it's very insulting to the public. So because of that, I feel very comfortable now answering the question directly. With that said, having a conservative identity is not the same thing as a partisan identity, and that I make it's very intentional that in terms of like party politics and all that I don't I've never endorsed a candidate or party, for example, and for me that's really actually important as well, because it's like once you dip your toe in that space, then I feel a journalist crosses the line, and you are now into the area of being an activist or being an influencer for a partisan cause. I think journalists should. It's really important as a matter of ethics to not do that, and journalism ethics is so important to me. You know, my detractors will call me like this far-right provocateur and all that. But if you look at actually what I write in my stuff, my body of work that's been published now since going back to 2017, the things that are guiding me is truth, accuracy, and ethics. So there have been times in the past and present, where I've reported something out that's been inaccurate. There haven't been a lot of incidents, but any time that it does happen, it's extremely disappointing to me. And so I have to correct the record, I have to inform people, and I have to apologize when I make those mistakes. And therefore it makes me so frustrated when you see journalists who are working at very big legacy institutions make errors, and then they refuse to correct it in stories that have been printed. A lot of times I reach out to them privately to ask them why, what they wrote is misleading or is omitting really important context, and usually I don't hear back. I often write to editors, for example, when they publish contributions from freelancers who don't disclose that they have certain conflicts of interest. For example, NBC, which is one of the major legacy media corporations in the United States, in their opinion section, they published a far-left writer from Portland who was defending Antifa. And nowhere in his writing or in his little bio line at the end of the piece are readers informed that he's actually involved in the Antifa movement as particularly with the Rose City Antifa group. And I had evidence of this, particularly through video and photo, that he was actually one of the secret trainers for one of these Antifa cells. And I contacted all of the editors in the opinion section for NBC, the ones who actually, I presume, edited and ran this piece. And none of them got back to me. That's been my experience generally. And so, sorry, I know you didn't ask particularly about
actually,
ethics, But like I bring that up just because I saw that on German, I forget which station it was, but one of the main legacy broadcast news stations, there was in reaction to the election results in Thüringen and Sachsen, with the AfD performing very well, there was this opening monologue from this news presenter comparing the election results to the Nazi invasion of Poland. So, like, in the, you know, that's really, I think, insulting to the memory of the Holocaust to like to do that. Although I guess all of us are probably used to it by now. That same playbook's been used all around the world against Trump, against other people, over and over. But I find that type of inflammatory rhetoric very unethical, and so I could vent forever. It's just, but unfortunately, this is our media reality in my country.
But I think that it is a very important issue that is worth elaborating even a little bit more on, because you mentioned this in the beginning of your answer. The question is, do you want to be a journalist or do you want to be an activist? And for example, when you describe your own ethics, right? There's, you have your own political leanings, but you still have certain values that guarantee the integrity of you as a journalist. But from the perspective of somebody who pursues an ideology, that is not for you personally, but that you could argue is almost a weakness. Because then you have, let's say, in an exaggeration, you have left of center journalists who say, well, we are journalists, but we're also activists. And then you have the right of center journalists who argue, well, we have our leanings, but overall we want to be objective journalists. And let me give a quick example. You mentioned Germany, and you're absolutely right about this. But I think we saw something similar happen in the United States as well. When you think back on the two incidents that I really think stand out. One was the Joe Biden is the fittest, smartest, healthiest president we ever had. And then after 24 hours after the debate with Donald Trump, it was like, he needs to go. He's obviously in stages of early dementia, and all these newspaper articles came out to the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, where you could read, well, we knew it since 2021. There were meetings in Germany where he couldn't come because he had to go to bed. That was in the Wall Street Journal at 8, so he couldn't meet Olaf Scholz. So they knew it, and they said the opposite. And there's one thing to have a leaning and saying, okay, you kind of want to give something a twist so that it supports your ideological position. But this is openly reporting falsehoods. And another example that I found even more surprising was the whole Kamala Harris border czar thing, right? Where you had the same news agencies, Axios was sort of them, who came out and said she never was the border czar. And then you had which is I think a great tool on Twitter now, the community notes, where you saw that Axios itself called her the border czar. So I understand if journalists have a leaning, and I will never look in a Maureen Dowd column for a defense of Republicans, because I understand where she's coming from. But one would still hope that even a left-leaning journalist says, I want to see the left in the most positive light, but I would never outright try to gaslight or, in the worst case, even lie to my audience. Or as you said in Germany, I mean, and by the way, just also important for the viewers, the journalist you mentioned, that is a public broadcaster, right? So this is somebody who is financed by money from the public, and they go out and say that in Thuringia, for example, 33% of the people who voted for the AfD are the same kind of people that are responsible for the invasion of Poland 85 years ago. I mean, this is not just exaggeration for dramatic effect. I mean, this I think in many cases, this is, as you say, it's either belittling the actual memory and insulting the actual memory of the Holocaust. And in the American case, it is openly lying to the public. So do you think, and because this, I'm almost getting a little bit personal here, because this also goes back to your personal experience, that on the left, and I think this, you have this on the right too, but I think it's more true on the left, that they are so convinced about the pureness, the righteousness of their convictions, that they can break the rules, that they can do things they would never allow or permit the other side to do. And if you don't have to talk, you don't if you want to. But this was also your experience, right? I mean, you were a victim of horrid acts of violence by the very people who also like to walk around with signs that say words are violence and silence is violence. Everything is, everybody gets triggered by something. But they themselves, of course, had every right to attack Andy Ngo, because Andy Ngo is on the side of evil. And if you fight against evil and you are on the side of good, everything is permitted.
Yeah, so I think since the end of the Second World War, the Western countries have understood who is evil in the Second World War. But in the decades that continued as history went on, people don't understand or don't know or don't want to know about the evils of left-wing tyranny in the form of dictatorial communist governments, for example, and the horrors that they enacted on humanity. My parents lived through a communist revolution. They, like many people from around the world who fled communist regimes or suffered at the hands of it, ended up in the United States as refugees. You see, people don't have an aversion to communist symbols in like social media profiles or even how people identify, compared to the horror that people have if somebody dares to have any type of fascist symbols. And so there are people much smarter than me who have tried to explain why and how this has happened. There are different hypotheses out there by much more intelligent people than me, mapping out the institutional takeovers of higher education and even K-12 education in the American context, of how you control education, you control the minds of the current of the next generation and future generations, which on a tangent I think is why the radical woke is so keen on introducing very extreme trans and gender ideology to younger and younger audiences in state education. With that being said, you brought up about my experience at the hands of far-left violent extremists, and that's how a lot of people have heard of me. It's the first beating that people may remember was back in 2019. It's where after I was punched repeatedly in the face and head and kicked and beaten by a mob, then the crowd threw their drinks on me. So the pictures and videos at that time show me drenched with this white liquid, and I'm bleeding from my ears and my eyes, and I suffered a brain hemorrhage. At that time, in the days after that, after being hospitalized, I looked online at the online reaction from the left, and I don't know why I was surprised. I shouldn't have been, but I was shocked in some way that many liberals had actually blamed me for the violence that I experienced. Like when I was being beaten, I didn't even push back at all. It was mostly because I was in shock. I didn't even really kind of realize what was happening. When you're being hit in every direction and it's difficult to see, you just see a whole, mobs of people dressed in black. I was surprised that even though part of that was caught on video, the response from those in so-called liberal organizations and liberal medias framed me as the agitator, that I had somehow brought that type of violence on myself by being there with the camera. And many left-wing journalists were espoused that type of view. I shouldn't have been surprised to see that, although I was. I think I really thought that they would have a bit more humanity. I guess for people who aren't familiar with my story, I was focused particularly on reporting on Antifa in Portland, Oregon. Portland, Oregon is in the northwest of the United States. It's a very left-wing city, and there's a element of the far left that's quite normalized in the city. And so I was one of the people who went out with my mobile phone to record some of these so-called direct actions from Antifa and the violent far left. And I went out because I was motivated by my frustration that I couldn't rely on the local legacy media in the local newspapers to accurately report on what was happening. It's not like the local papers were lying, it was that they were providing a bias and incomplete picture of what was happening. So they would downplay the violence, which is something that many of us are familiar with now, even when it's caught on video, like with the CNN, Chiron, and many other instances. But they would downplay the violence, deny it, and or play, knowingly or not, use the propaganda language of Antifa on the far left. For example, referring to Antifa as anti-fascists who are protesting against racism. Immediately when you frame it in that way, narrate it in that way, that is the propaganda language of Antifa. Whereas I would say, actually, these are people who are organized violent extremists who use threats and harassment and acts of violence to silence other Americans who are engaging in their protected rights in freedom of expression. And I became a target because it was seen as intolerable that I would defend the free speech of people who were Trump supporters, for example, or had views against mass migration. And even though I, at that time, didn't express my own views on those topics, but I was trying to stick to, and I thought as somebody who worked in media that this is a principle you should have at the forefront, is that you need to make sure that people's civil rights aren't violated. And Antifa are quite open that they have the illiberal agenda in that they find speech is dangerous and that it needs to be curtailed, the wrong type of speech, curtailed through the use of violence when needed, and even killing if it needs to come to that. And what disturbs me then and disturbs me now is how that type of extremism is given legitimacy by those who have a mandate to actually protect civil liberties. Politicians, of course, many of them take an oath to the American Constitution. Journalist organizations and media institutions are meant to protect freedom of the press. And when journalists have been beaten or robbed or threatened or harassed by Antifa whilst covering them in public, none of these organizations will come out to defend these journalists at best. And oftentimes they will write hit pieces about us. So I ended up writing a book about Antifa called Unmasked, Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy. It was a shock New York Times bestseller. I'm still really honored and indebted to the public that they felt that what I had to say, what I have experienced, what I wrote down about the 2020 riots and everything that led up to that, about Chaz. Chaz is the so-called autonomous zone violent takeover in Seattle in 2020. I'm so honored that people went out and bought my book and read it, just because in the course of my journalism career, I've been actually really isolated. Establishment journalism acts really as a club in a way, particularly if you work at the big publications that are based in Washington, D.C. or New York City. They have their social clubs, their parties, their gatherings, and their friends and networks. And if you are perceived as somebody who works in conservative media, you're persona non grata. And so I've been independent in my work. And at times that's been really hard. It can be difficult to not have institutional support. It can be really disappointing when, after being beaten in the course of engaging in journalistic activities, writing to organizations that say that they advocate for journalists' rights, to not hear back at all. Or if they interview me, they'll have a huge caveat in their posts that some people don't view me as a journalist. That's just what happened with the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker, for example. So, to sum it up, I don't do the work that I do to be popular. In fact, I learned early on very quickly that challenging liberal orthodoxy is the quickest way to become really hated and vilified. Some of the ways I've been vilified is still shocking to me. Earlier, you were talking about AI, for example. AI pulls from information that usually like legacy media sources, the same type of things that Google will pull up in their search results and what people will use as citations on Wikipedia. And it's if you Google me, if you search me, if you go on my Wikipedia, you'll come up with this impression that I'm this far-right extremist. And it feels helpless in many ways, that like I have no control over that. And so I guess all I can do is hold myself up to the highest standard possible, which is why accuracy is the most important thing, and owning up responsibility, owning up when I make a mistake. I think one thing that has changed on X is that I've been thinking about this a lot, is that now that accounts can be monetized on X through just the ad revenue, there are positives and negatives. The positives is that people like me and other independent journalists now can make a little bit of money off some of the posts that we otherwise would have made nothing. I mean, I've been on Twitter since 2014, so for most of its existence, I was putting out content for free. It was because I was really passionate about getting out information, and it was hours and hours of work every day. For example, one of the things that people remembered me for is that I posted the mugshots of the Antifa riot arrestees in Portland. What people don't know is that for every mugshot, that required a public records request form, and I had to do that every day, and there were more than 1,000 arrests. It was a lot of work. I put it out. Not a penny was made off any of that. Now that under Elon Musk, that accounts can be monetized, what I guess the dark side of that we see is that there is a form of engagement farming from, I don't even know what you call them. They're not influencers or what, people who are just interested in going viral by any means necessary, posting fake news or misleading news. And you see this on the right and left. The politics of it don't really matter. It's people who are trying to make money. And it's created I would say a challenging atmosphere to be a part of on X. And I say that as somebody who is a very big supporter of what Elon Musk has done and the arrows that he takes for being the one person who has pushed back against the liberal establishment. But I'm on X a lot, and a lot of the news that I break is on there. So I think it's appropriate for me to point out that there are some vulnerabilities I see on how things are on there currently.
I do believe you make a very good point here, and we have been quite critical of the left, but I think you point in the very correct direction, which is that particularly what you mentioned on X, there seems to be a trend as well on the political right, or on some, let's call them influencers or prominent figures on the right, who within the last 12 to 18 months in many areas have taken positions where I would say we don't have to go into any specific names, but have taken positions where I sense that they do know better. But exactly as you just said, the more eyes that gets to the content, the more beneficial it is financially. And that is I agree with you. I think that is it's a mixture. I guess on the one hand, it's a negative trend for the obvious reasons that you mentioned, but the other one is that you can, of course, then I guess tell yourself, if you would be in the position of those people, that for years, and that's understanding but not approving, for years, as we also discussed today, the journalistic ethics that you mentioned, they have been so steeply declining that it was only a matter of time until everybody at some point says, I will not use an expletive here, but F it, nobody cares anyways. As long as I can get the eyeballs, as long as I can get the clicks, who cares? It's like it spreads, right? If a crucial mass gives up on a certain ethos in journalism, then those who don't give up on it have no benefit either in reputation or financially coming from it. I guess then everybody's going to give it at some point, and then you end up a little bit the situation you have now, that it's really hard to find media that you can trust for everyone. So this is not a left right wing thing. This is a just very, very difficult to find reliable information kind of thing.
Yeah, and on X, it's really social media generally. I shouldn't focus only on X, but social media generally, it's this Wild West, in that I see constantly, because the algorithms are giving me primarily right-wing or more conservative accounts, I see misinfo and disinfo going viral by these accounts every day, and I've pushed back on it as much as I can. It's not right-wing misinfo is not one of my beats, but sometimes if there's things that are really egregious, I'll make a post about how it's false. I think I encourage people who use X and who get news off X when the citation source is one that doesn't have like a big brand or name associated to it, that you be extra skeptical. I mean, you should be skeptical generally, but if it's just a viral post from a random account, that even the act of resharing it, it spreads it huge. And I'm focusing on the right here, but it might make some people upset in that. But there's a lot of danger. For example, after the stabbings in Southport, and 3 girls were killed and many other children were seriously injured, there was viral misinformation primarily from accounts that are critical of immigration or Islam, spreading this false claim that the knife man was a Syrian migrant, and there was a name attached to it that was completely false. It was fake news, and yet it went really viral, and that, in my view, motivated people to go to a mosque in Southport, and they threw projectiles at it and vandalized it. And so, that's kind of like a real life consequence of it. So, with everything I was saying earlier about like being critical of so-called censorship efforts, we do have also then this real life problem of what do you do when misinformation and disinformation can actually lead to real life violence. And sometimes it does happen. I think the amount that happens is overstated by liberals and the left. But it can happen, obviously. And I think the liberals will never admit it, but the whole BLM movement was built off of viral lies. You would have, for example, videos that capture one short moment of some long interaction involving a suspect and law enforcement, and this 5-second clip is shared online with some inflammatory text about racist police and institutionally racist police, and then it fuels people to go out on the street and to riot. Of course, when BLM and leftists do it, liberals don't see that as a problem at all. In fact, many of these politicians were spreading this type of content before. I'm really thankful now that X, the community notes feature, is a very important feature of X now. It wasn't before under Twitter, under the prior ownership. But still, it's like, yes, we live in this world now where misinfo and disinfo is used by bad faith actors. Some of them are even affiliated with various state actors as well, spreading misinformation. A lot of people keep thinking that Russia's only agenda is to empower the right. That's actually false. Back in 2016, there were these really viral BLM-associated accounts on social media that spread a lot of misinfo for the cause of BLM, and they were found to be allegedly linked to Russian state actors as well. Nobody really focuses on it when the shoe's on the other foot. So, and in my book, if you read my book, I focus a lot on how Twitter in 2020 was used as one of the main organizing spaces for Antifa and the radical left to riot. They would announce where to go, how to fundraise for it, what tactics to use, like Black Bloc, which is where you wear the mask and you dress all in black, what weapons to bring. And these accounts were not suspended at all for this organizing of violence, incitement of violence. You know, sometimes it's a whack-a-mole game in that you close one, another one comes up, and these networks are really connected with one another. So even if one account goes down, another one can come up, and then that account is shared within these networks, and these posts can go viral again. We saw a little bit of that being used again with some of the Palestine demonstrations and protests in Western countries recently. And so, you know, there's not really an easy answer to all these issues that I bring up, right? It's like incitement of violence. It's about misinfo and content moderation and all that.
If you would like to hear the full conversation, please jump over to Brussels Signal. The link is provided in the description, and enjoy the conversation where we touch on many more additional topics.